select board chose to hold when we scheduled the vote, we decided to also hold an informational meeting. There is a great deal of information in the zoning regulations and a great deal of background and a great deal of what might happen in the future that we want to cover. And looking down the list of items we want to cover, several of those items could each take an hour on their own. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through with the select board and the planning commission and some members of the DRB. And we're going to cover the information that we want to make sure gets included in our presentation today. And then we'll open it up for questions. And we're doing it that way just because there's a real risk of getting a third of the way through and then it's 10 o'clock and everybody's tired and wants to go home. So if you have a piece of paper and pen and you want to make notes to ask questions, but that's how we're going to proceed as we get started. And I will say, I was going to say this because I wasn't sure he was going to be here, but I'll say it anyway, since my husband just walked in. I've been hearing a lot at home that we need to find a way to explain the zoning regulations in a simple, easy, brief manner so that everybody can easily understand what's in them and how they work and how everything fits together. And I have to tell you, that just doesn't seem to work. If you try to look at any part of the zoning regulations and say yes or no, the answer is yes but, or no maybe. And they all work together as a whole. And every project that's looked at, everything that is proposed as a development, needs to have the entire whole of the zoning regulations applied to it before a reasonable and fair decision can be made. And that just means that there are very few things that don't take a lot of thought and a lot of explanation. And trying to pick out the one thing that I think is important or one thing that anybody else thinks is important and just take that one sentence is not going to give a complete picture of the whole of what the DRB has to work with and what the Planning Commission has been working on for the past 4.5 years. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background and just talk about the goals of the zoning bylaws, what they're supposed to do. And they're summarized in the bylaws. The purpose is in section 102. And they implement policies of the Starksboro Town Plan and the Vermont Planning and Development. And they're intended to protect public health and safety, protect and conserve natural, scenic, and historic resources, protect and conserve rural character, working land, and open space, ensure that the rate of growth in land development does not exceed Starksboro's ability to provide service and does not place an undue burden on taxpayers, and allow for housing for equal needs of residents as described in the Starksboro Town Plan. So the Starksboro Town Plan is the underlying document for what happens in the zoning regulations. They're supposed to provide a rational, understandable, and also consistent and fair process to be used by our zoning administrator who issues permits that fall under his review, and then by the development review board when somebody has a project that comes before them. And that consistency and fairness is really very important. It's not only the right thing to do, but that is something that will get the town in a lot of trouble if the zoning regulations are not applied consistently and fairly, and somebody notices that. The people who have been working on these zoning regulations, our 7-member planning commission, a lot of people in Starksboro don't seem to know this. Our planning commission is elected, and there are only about 5 towns in all of Vermont that elect their planning commissions. Virtually every town in Vermont, the planning commission is appointed by the select board. But the voters of Starksboro independently elect our planning commission and independently elect the select board. So the planning commission spent 8 years working on the town plan, but put a lot of effort into it, and the public hearings that were held, the workshops that were done, all the things that happened to create the town plan are outlined in the town plan. So, and also many of the survey results that we did are included in the town plan. And as soon as that town plan was done, they immediately began working on the zoning regulations to put together a set of zoning regulations that fit in well with the town plan, were based on the new town plan that was adopted. That took about 4 years. And during that 4 years, that was pretty much what you guys worked on, I think. I think we pretty much spent every meeting going over, working with the consultant, working with the Exton County Regional Planning Commission, and reviewing every aspect of what was in the zoning regulations, trying to make sure that they had one coherent, comprehensive document that complied with state law, that was reviewed before they even gave it to the select board by the Exton County Regional Planning Commission. They worked with a consultant who also works in many other towns in Scottsboro to try to put together information that would not be so far, I don't know how to say it, would not be so far off, it would be similar to what other towns do when they put together zoning regulations. And let's see, what else? Of course, all those meetings that the Planning Commission held were public meetings, and many people attended regularly, thank you for being there. And then after the Planning Commission said, whew, thank goodness, and gave it to the Planning Commission held a public hearing, they got a lot of feedback, and they incorporated much of that feedback into the set of zoning regulations that they gave to the select board. The select board held 2 public hearings. We decided to vote on it as a select board, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's the common practice in the surrounding towns. There's Bristol votes on the town of Bristol votes on their zoning regulations because they are required to do so, because it was passed at town meeting several years ago. Exton County Regional Planning Commission recommends that we walk down the law for adopting zoning regulations. The default position is that the zoning regulations will be adopted by the select board in any given town. And the fallback position is to have a public vote, which is allowed for by petition, which is what we got on here today. The other thing I just want to say is and I mentioned this earlier, it is really important and it's really hard because I am so tired of reading zoning regulations, and I really want to read a novel just for once. And it's really hard to look at the zoning regulations in a vacuum. You have to look at the town plan, the entirety of the zoning regulations, take the whole process as a whole, and see how it fits together in order to move forward. And that's what we've tried to do, and that's what we'd like to talk about. That's how we got where we are, and I'm going to stop talking myself. I'm going to ask Marjorie Dickstein, who's been on the development review board 6 years now, and has been dealing with the 2006 zoning regulations for the entire 6 years. I'm going to ask her to cover some of the things that she has noticed in her 6 years on the development review board.
Susan, excuse me for interrupting. I know who you are, but I don't know who everyone is, and I wonder, could we take a minute and just hear everyone's name and if they're on the select board or the planning party? Thank you.
I talk all the time. I'm Susan Jeffries, I'm the select board.
I'm Dave Wetmore, the zoning administrator. Tony Porter, select board.
Marjorie Dickstein, I'm on the DRB.
Hugh Johnson, I'm on the planning commission and former member of the DRB.
Peter Marsh, select board.
Norm Cole, planning board.
Jeff Keeney, Planning Commission.
Dave Nugent, DRB and Planning Commission.
Dan Harris, Planning Commission.
Dennis Casey, planning commission.
Thank you.
Marjorie.
Okay,
So
so
very soft spoken.
every aspect of zoning, and therefore, anything that I say that is a view or an opinion is mine, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. One clarification I want to make, I've had some conversations with people about zoning, and some think that when the petition went around and was submitted, that actually took the new zoning out of effect or kept it from being adopted. And that's not actually the case. What it did is create a situation where the old and the new at the moment are both in effect, and we've been interpreting both of them for some time now with every case that's come before us. I attended the June 25th meeting that the select board held, and there was somebody in that meeting who said that she felt that the DRB should be able to use common sense to set conditions on every application, and that therefore she didn't see a need for more specific zoning regulations than we already have. And I was actually somewhat happy with that comment, because I appreciate that people trust us to use good judgment. But it also made me wonder whether people understand what comes before us and what doesn't. There were 46 permits issued in Starksboro last year, and only 5 of them had any involvement at all by the DRB. That is because the current zoning regulations, or what we're calling the old regulations, I guess, permit a lot of uses outright. They don't require any DRB hearing. And when those applications come to the zoning administrator, they don't require any hearing. There's no public notice. There's no opportunity for neighbors to express any concerns or to necessarily even be aware of the project. And there's no opportunity for the Development Review Board to put any conditions on those projects. We don't even know about them. And that is the case for most new houses, residential additions, and a lot of home businesses and home occupations. Those things don't come to us, and so there's no way to put any project-specific conditions on them. So for those projects that are permitted outright, the zoning regulations are very important because they're the only regulations. So if Dave is not allowed to put conditions on projects when he issues permits. If somebody fills out the application and establishes that they've met the regulations and pays the fee, then he has to issue them a permit, and he doesn't get to add any common sense conditions of his own. So that's the situation for those projects that everything in the current zoning that says that it doesn't require DRB involvement. Then there are several types of projects that do require DRB involvement and uses. And so we hear conditional use applications, and we also hear appeals of the zoning administrator's decisions occasionally, and most subdivisions come to us, most subdivisions and boundary adjustments come to us. And that for those we do put conditions on things, and those are warned, and those give people an opportunity to come and voice their opinions on those. In the old regulations, there are a few things that are prohibited. One is commercial dog kennels, another is junkyards, another is toxic waste, and the only other one I could think of off the top of my head is you can't have more than 3 junked vehicles visible from a road. And there is a statement in the old regulations that if use is not included in them, that it isn't permitted. But in practice, the categories of uses that are permitted and the definitions are so broad that it lets most uses be argued into being allowed. And also some things that are in the new regulations, such as I think drive-through window has come up a number of times. There's nothing in the old regulations that would prohibit a drive-through window. It's an appurtenance to a type of business, so we would have to consider it. We wouldn't be able to just ban its existence. And without any specifics, we wouldn't really have anything to go on as to what the Planning Commission and the people who elected the Planning Commission intended specifically with something like that. And we run into these issues all the time with the current zoning. There are not a lot of clear definitions, and when we come to something like the building envelope, do they mean the building itself? Do they count the outbuildings with that? Does pavement count? Does it count if it's gravel? Is warehouse the same as storage? Why do some of the boundaries on the map not match the written descriptions in the book? And in that case, which one are we supposed to use? Sometimes the intent is not that clear to us, and it's also not that clear to the applicants. People tend to bring us Wikipedia definitions and other definitions that they find online, and dictionaries and that sort of thing. And their lawyers and their land use consultants usually bring us zoning from other towns. And so I'm not saying that we have any obligation to use those things, but it seems sort of strange to me that we are having to rely on other towns' zoning, and who knows whether their zoning intent is or should be the same as ours, because we don't have our own. And I've been hearing this fear that if we get too specific with our zoning, that then if we put an upper limit for anything, size, height, lighting limits, sound limits, that somehow the DRB is obligated to permit projects up to those limits, and that is not true. That was asked and answered years ago by Brandy Saxton, the planning consultant, and it also has been answered by regional planning, and I believe by at least one of our town's lawyers. We can still put conditions on those projects that don't let them go to those limits if we can justify those. And I can also say from experience that most of the surrounding towns do the same thing. I mean, if you go to Moncton, they have in their zoning that a building can be 40 feet high, but in reality, the DRB tends to not let that happen. And if we can say that there's a reason because of a view, or it's going to cast shadows on somebody else, or the fire trucks can't reach it on that particular site, then we can still put valid conditions on those properties. So the third way that the zoning regulations matter is if something is appealed. If one of the zoning administrator's decisions is appealed, then it goes to the DRB. And then if one of the DRB's decisions is appealed, then it goes to environmental court. And if it goes to environmental court, it is heard as if the case never was heard before. They're not allowed to consider anything that the DRB might have conditioned that project with, or anything that went on in the meetings, or anything that was said by neighbors. It's a whole new thing. Zoning, usually town zoning and DRB people are not involved with that. And there may be, in some cases, more than one side. I mean, you can have an environmental court case where the original applicant and the town and more than one neighbor are all separate parties to that case. It is true, I read somebody on Front Porch Forum said that sometimes ambiguity can be beneficial. And that is true, but it's always beneficial to one side. And if you have 2 to 4 sides to something, it's not always your side that it benefits. And most often it is not the town's side that benefits. And I think that the regulations have already been reviewed by the town's lawyers also, and that you cannot make these things bulletproof, but they have been advised, and those people have done the best that they can. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is the enforcement. Way back 7 years ago when we were working on the workshops for the town plan, there were people who said they wanted limits for things like light and noise and traffic. Some of them described specific situations and said one light bulb for my neighbor's house is ruining my life. And some of the same people are saying the same things in the meetings that we just had earlier this summer. There's nothing in the current zoning that lets the zoning administrator do anything about those situations, because the only thing in there is that everything needs to meet the character of the area. And there's just no such thing as a character of the area meter that we can send out with to measure these things. So, and also we have had some situations where things have come to the DRB, and we will have somebody who has previously gotten the conditional use approval, and by their own admission and their neighbor's testimony is not complying with the conditions that were set. There's no process in the current regulations to address that, and yet we've been told by one of the town's lawyers when we asked for an opinion on that, that we cannot refuse to provide or approve the next conditional use permit that they ask for yet another use on the same site, running concurrently with the first one where we know they're not complying. We don't have any process to address that, but the new guidelines do. They have a series of procedures, and they give us things we can do about that and things we can measure. And if we put a light limit, we can measure the limit with a meter, and if we put a sound limit, we can measure that, and if we put traffic, that can even be counted. But if we just say character of the neighborhood, we really can't enforce anything. And the same people who have been complaining for 7 years about the same light bulb don't really have any recourse. I think that's everything I wanted to say about that.
Thanks. I'm going to mention one other thing about the current regulations as compared to the town plan, and well, as compared to reality, actually. The current zoning districts don't really, they don't encompass the way the town is actually developed. So, for example, I think that somebody on the planning commission actually did a count. There are more homes in the area south of Starksboro Village than there are in Starksboro Village. That's actually a higher density area, but it is not currently included in high density. So that just seems a little bit odd to have an area that is that developed that is not included as a high density area. So these regulations look at the existing development and then also look at where we might like to see development. And as many of us who would rather not see any development, I just assume not personally, that's just, I don't know how we can do that. I honestly, I don't know how we can just say, okay, I'm here, I have my house, shut it down. And I don't think that that would be fair to landowners in town. So we looked at, not we, I the existing development within the town, at the topography. So the zoning districts are drawn to conform with slopes and streams and things that just naturally create boundaries. And then also to encompass areas where there is existing development, just to accept the fact that yes, those houses are there, that trailer park is there, they're not going away, and it is high density, we should call it that. And the next topic that we wanted to talk about, and I hope everybody has some coffee so you can stay awake through all this because it can be pretty dry. The next topic that we wanted to talk about was the thought process and the work and the things that went into the current regulations. And fortunately, Hugh volunteered to take that over because he spent years in his life working on it.
Yeah, for one, yes, we do believe that the new regulations are in compliance with the town plan, with the current town plan, and that's been confirmed by Addison County Regional Planning, as well as our own lawyer and Randy. It is a good subdivision regulation, and it combines the subdivision, the zoning, and the flood hazards all in one single document. So you're not going back and forth between a couple of different documents, getting slightly different definitions, slightly different takes, and that little bit of confusion. It also includes a couple of important things in that we have some good exemptions for minor projects. In the old plans, we didn't really address fences. Well, you can't have your fence, where else is it going to be but on the property line? You're not going to have it in setback, so things like that are better addressed. Waivers is also a big problem always. If you have a pre-existing non-compliant house, and there's a lot of those in town, you try and add on to it, and you need a waiver because you're further into the setback, or you need a variance, and variances are not supposed to be granted. So with waiver language, with a pre-existing non-conforming use, you can waive the setback requirements, and it's just a little legal semantics, but it's going down the road, if things ever come to court, something like that, it's important legal semantics. The other thing that I think I want to go over is the evolution of the Chapter 210 Use Density and Dimensional Standards. And that is the chart that was featured in some of the presentations. And one of the major comments was that all of these commercial uses and other uses are suddenly conditional use in the agricultural and scenic district, which is quite new. The reason that happened is that in case law that has been developed in really the past 10 years with zoning, it's come out that you cannot prohibit a use throughout town. You can't say no gas stations in Starksboro. You have to put them somewhere. You can't do it. That would be a direct prohibit. And the indirect way would be to say, well, you can put it, but only where everything's already built up. So essentially, if we're going to have these uses, we have to put them somewhere. And if we don't want them way up on our Class 3 roads, which is very inappropriate, what is left is the corridor, 116. And that's why we did that, and it is a conditional use. Having said that, with our goal of the agricultural district to preserve agricultural lands, a very important piece of that chapter is section 211, where it goes to lot coverage. And this gets a little tricky, but if a farmer were to say, all right, I'm going to sell off a lot for a commercial use, within our regulations, that lot can either be between a half an acre and 2 acres, or at least 25. So he's probably going to sell off a 2-acre lot. With the lot coverage, then for commercial use in the agricultural, well, actually in any district except the high density, you cannot have a area of impervious surface greater than 20% of that lot. Now you think about that, so you've got 2 acres, and you can't have more than 2/5 of an acre being actually developed with driveway, parking lot, and the building. To give you a visual on it, this table is 6 feet long. And that would be about 28 inches, about to there. So this section of that lot is what could be developed. The rest would be left out. That also goes to another concern, which was with the lighting, because again, the lighting standard for commercial is 50,000 lumens per acre, but he's only got 2/5 of an acre actually developed. So the DRB would say, well, that sounds to me, at least chatting with Dan, I haven't chatted with Marjorie on this one yet, but he would interpret it, that means that, okay, well, we'll start with 20,000, you know, to light up your parking lot, your building, and everything else. That should do it. And again, within the lighting standards, it has to be downshielded. It can't trespass onto other people's properties. It has to, and anything like in a parking lot, it can't be too close to the edge of that parking lot. So, or it has to be directed back at the parking lot. And all of that, and that goes to keeping the idea of suddenly having all of the agricultural and scenic district looking like a commercial district, because 1, 3/5 of the land is left open, and 2, it very much limit the amount of actual lighting, driveway, and all of that sort of thing. So I'm just pointing that out because it's an extremely important, it is really the guts of a lot of this is in this lot, density and dimensional standards. And it goes not only in the agricultural district, but also low density and medium density districts. So those same standards would apply there. And the idea is that, again, trying to keep things off of class 3 roads. And through the density and dimensional standards chart, you will see that a lot of these conditional uses shall be located on a state highway or a class 2 road. So it keeps them down out of the hills where we know that the traffic and increased traffic is a real concern. And that is pretty much, yeah, so on a larger lot, it would be a 3-acre maximum. So if somebody does decide to sell 25 acres of their farm, okay, that's the most they can sell. On that lot, a commercial use could only be 3 acres total, and the rest would be conserved.
Can I ask you a question?
Actually, we're trying to get through everything.
But it relates directly to what he's saying, but did you
Yeah, but we can get so sidetracked if we start doing that. Can you make a note, please? Because we're kind of at the end. I just don't want to go.
mistake?
Let me see. While I've got the mic, I know that there's been a lot of talk about the density bonus, and we looked at it and said, you know, I guess that wasn't as clear as we all thought it was. And we've already unofficially talked about some language to correct it, whereas the DRB may grant a density bonus for the PUD, provides that provides affordable for elderly housing of up to 100%. And it hasn't gone through yet, but so far the language is going to be changed to the DRB may grant a density bonus for a PUD that is dedicated in perpetuity to affordable for elderly housing. So it will take that idea that somehow whether somebody can sneak in one older person's home and have 100% density bonus to the rest of it, and it takes that one off. You know, we can read this thing a million times and we'll always find another little spot that something can be corrected or made better. The other one,
We're going to come to this one.
yeah, we're going to get to that later. So. I hope somebody is. Okay, so, and there's been a criticism that there's no real definition of a conditional use. Our thinking was is that conditional, people know that. Use, people know that. Conditional use, it's pretty much straight English, but if you read the applicability, specific land use and development that requires DRB approved as conditional use, and it's listed as part 2. So there is a working definition in the document, even though it's not in definitions. I think that was what I have.
All right, so I'm going to start by apologizing to Hugh because he mentioned this to me earlier and I just wasn't focusing. But 20% coverage is 1/5, not 2/5. So it's actually half of the amount that he was showing me because 20% would be 1/5. So that would be the amount.
2 acres, that would be 2/5 of an acre. Sorry.
Yeah.
I get nervous.
Sorry, I'm an accountant, I have to get these things straight. I can't stand it if we don't have the numbers right. One thing we also wanted to discuss was the growth cap, which has been in prior town plans, a maximum of 15 permits per year. It is not in this town plan, and that is on the advice of the Addison County Regional Planning Commission. And after discussion with a lawyer who removed these plans with us, and after doing some research, growth caps have actually not been challenged in the state of Vermont. There was one case that a town was Georgia was somebody challenged their growth caps, and Georgia was going to fight it and say, no, these are our growth caps. And after they reviewed the law surrounding planning, they decided not to fight it because they felt that the odds of their being able to have their caps upheld in court were really non-existent, and all they could do out of that was get a legal fee. So there's no case law. The recent trend in zoning regulations that have been written around the state during the past several years has been to eliminate any kind of growth caps. We do have a cap in there that was frankly not recommended by the people that we worked with, and that is a cap on the number of permits a person can apply for in a given year. So there is something in there. It isn't a 15 cap maximum, but there is something that would keep somebody from buying up a whole lot of land and then going wild and developing 50 houses all at once. Anyway, that's why it's not in there. Something that we wanted to cover, and if anybody besides me wants to talk about this, that would be great, but I'm happy to point it out on the charts over there, are the new zones and the way that the zoning map has been drawn. So I'm going to turn this off, and I'll just go over there and try to project. Unless somebody else wants to. Okay, so This is forestry, this is where we work under the 2006 zoning regulations. This is forestry and conservation. You can tell that it's way more than half of the town. It is still way more than half of the town in the proposed regulations. It goes from, actually, goes from 66% currently to 67%, so it increases slightly from the proposed regulations. These two areas are pretty similar, but this area here is agricultural, scenic, and rural residential. And that's another large chunk of our land. And that goes from 17% to 14%. And I believe that that is largely due to the creation of the medium density residential and commercial.
And the extension of the high-density district
Oh,
at the ledges south to Tatro Road.
yeah. Well, and
That's
off-
correct, but we added
and
high.
offset by a reduction in South Jackson, yes. Yeah. So, yeah, that's one where it's hard to look at just the total acreage because the high density of south was reduced. And that was the part that had gone up class 2. It was not on a paved road. My understanding it was the part that went up Jerusalem Road. So that has been put back into low density from high density. And then the village was extended to the south to basically cover the area that is mostly already entirely developed at the 1 acre level. This part here is low density residential and commercial, and that stayed about the same, 14% to 15%. There's actually a thing here that's 0%. The medium density residential and development was created, and that is 1% of the total acreage in Stubbs Road is devoted to medium density residential and development. This one, high density is 2%, and it goes to 3%. And again, that's reduction of south and then add for the village. And you know what we have now, and I don't know if a lot of people know it, in Starksboro today there is a heavy industrial area. And it is currently entirely owned by the town. And the town doesn't really have much heavy industrial use. So we don't have a lot of concerns about that being developed as heavy industry. However, part of the heavy industrial zone is under contract to be sold. So it's not always going to be owned by the town. And I believe the DRB put some conditions on that sale because it did have to go to them, that it couldn't be used for heavy industry. But it seemed to make sense to the Planning Commission and to the Select Board to just eliminate that district because that wasn't anything that we were looking to have. So that district has been eliminated. And there's also a very small watershed protection district that has stayed the same. So that's the big picture, just in terms of the number of acres of land. And let's get into my map. This is the village. This is a whole map, but it's too hard to see anywhere. This is the village. This is the area where medium density would go in. And then I'm looking for the old line. Dave could probably point it out for me. Right out here, the old high density line. So right along there, isn't it?
Pretty much. Yeah, follows the gravel pit.
Yeah. Okay, so right through there. So it's this area that has been added, and there's the trailer park, and you know there are lots of houses along there. So at any rate, most of it is actually pretty well developed. And then this one, which I will not be able to read unless I turn it this way, this is 17 coming up here up south. So we'll have that right. Yeah. And it extends 17 up here. The medium density has been added here. And again, that largely reflects existing homes, houses that are already there. And then this area is high density, I believe, high density.
Extended up around the corner on Jerusalem Road, that was
Currently goes up this
was
way.
reduced to low density.
Yeah.
Had a recommendation many, many years ago from the residents of South to do that.
So-
And actually shrunk it so it's only 800 feet deep. Rather, it was quite a bit deeper up Jim Dwyer Road up in that area.
Okay, so if it's the property right next to you, it's a huge change. If you look at the town as a whole, I guess I don't see that there are any overwhelming sweeping changes, unless you have the building right next to them, which I can certainly understand would be a different level of concern. You mentioned that we have performance standards in place for lighting, noise, signs, stormwater, site engineering and design. And I think that, I'm not on the DRB, but one of the things that has concerned me as a select board member, and I've said several times that the planning commission and the DRB have much harder jobs than the select board, and could get the town in much more trouble than the select board. If the DRB does not apply, are you having trouble hearing me? Let me see if I can bring that. I shall turn up my sound here and try not to blast everybody out. If people on the DRB change, circumstances change, every project is different in some way from every other project, and that makes it difficult for the DRB to be consistent and fair from project to project in applying the zoning regulations, particularly when there's some lack of specificity in those regulations that they're trying to work with. That, I think, that would be something that somebody might choose to fight and the town could lose if the DRB said yes to this one and no to that one, and the projects were essentially similar. And again, I'm not the expert on this. I have not tried to do this, but I do have a concern that it would be very difficult to be consistent with so little guidance, and that the guidance would create a greater level of consistency and a greater level of fairness to everybody in town who has something that they want to do. Something else that maybe somebody over there could get the chart if it's over there. Did you bring the chart about the transfer of building rights?
Maybe on the back.
Because something that I think will help encourage the maintenance of large open areas of land is giving people the ability to transfer their building rights to a lower density area and do planned unit developments, to cluster homes together on smaller lots and leave large open areas of land. And the proposed zoning regulations allow for that throughout town, but in ways that, for example, if someone, and many people do, if someone owned land that extended from high density through agricultural land into forest and conservation, they wouldn't have to sell off 25 acres of forest and conservation, 25 here, 25 there, 5 here, 5 there. They could move their building rights to the high density district, cluster them together on smaller lots, and leave all of that open land for agricultural or natural or whatever purposes. And I personally think that I think it strikes a nice balance between the town wanting to preserve open land, wanting to preserve agricultural land, but not wanting to take away the rights of existing property owners. And that is what we try to do with the zoning regulations, is to find that balance between what we want to see as a town And yet, people own property and they have rights to that property. And we don't want to, and probably again get in trouble if we attempted to legislate those rights away. So this is a way to try to find a balance between those things.
Susan, can I just add, you mentioned PUD, I just wanted to articulate that I think when the board was looking at this, they determined that anything over 4 lots, 5 or more, was going to be required to be a PUD. I know that's distasteful to some folks, but the point is, less than 4 lots, or 4 lots or less is maybe something that would fall to the average person who wants to subdivide off a lot or two for their child or their children. It's a smaller unit. Whereas when you dump it to a PUD, there's much more regulation to it, much more input from the DRB, and I know that a lot of concentration has been on the density bonus, but I do want to raise people's awareness that the bylaws under a PUD clearly state open space standards, which do not apply to the high density district, but they apply to all other districts. And that is that it requires 60% conservation of that land as part of the concession for a PUD. Well, that's a pretty substantial concession to allowing to being able to develop property. So these bylaws and the concept of a PUD does allow the DRB a great deal of input to make sure conservation of our natural resources does take place. I made just one comment. I said more than 4, and that's true with every district up to the forest conservation. Forest conservation, anything more than 2 lots requires a PUD. If a subdivision takes place there.
Thanks. Peter's going to address the next couple of things, but one thing I want to say about areas of concern and why we're going to be talking about those is that we are in a situation where the town plan will be expiring in a month. After all those years of effort and all the years of effort immediately put into the zoning regulations. And when the town plan is expired, it takes away some of the rights of the town to do certain things. And one of those is to make any changes related to zoning, which is why we, rather than stop the presses and immediately fix these areas of concern and then go back and redo the zoning regulations, the select board decided to adopt the zoning regulations and then address our areas of concern through interim zoning. So that if you see something in there that's on the list of areas of concern, it isn't something that we intend to live with for longer than it takes us to adopt interim zoning, which is actually a pretty good process. So,
Excuse me, I hate to interrupt, I know you don't want to, but the whole idea of the town plan expiring, what do you do then?
well, we'll get to that. That's next.
So there are some areas of concern that we've had and have also have come up in some of the meetings that have occurred. And these are things that Susan said we intend to address very immediately. Assuming that the vote passes next Tuesday, this will be the next thing on our agenda would be to deal with some of the lack of definition or missing definitions or definitions that aren't specific enough. For example, the definition of elderly housing is not really well done, and that is something that will be very easy to remedy, and we will do that. The new regulations that we're proposing have no definition of conditional use, even though the old ones did, so we have added that, and we actually have examples of the language that we're proposing. And as you mentioned, the density bonus was kind of muddy, very much muddy actually in the new regulations, and we have language that you mentioned that will take care of that. So another thing was on concern about one limit that would one standard that would limit any new growth that would provide more than 25% traffic on roads. And in some places in town, particularly in some of the class 4 roads, you know, a house with 3 teenagers would probably exceed the existing traffic by 25%. So what we have done is proposing changing that to 25% increase in non-residential traffic, because that's our major concern. So those are some of the areas of concern. There's a couple of other things that I want to reinforce what was said earlier. One of the things, one reason why we don't have growth cap in the regulations is the state law specifically prohibits it unless you have a capital budget. And a capital budget is a system intended to measure the impact of new growth, particularly residential growth, on a town and what that may mean to town services. And the larger towns and cities in Vermont generally all have that. We were looking at it, we've actually considered it. The problem is we don't have much for municipal services. We have essentially schools and roads, and that's the majority of it. We lack a town water system, town sewer, we have a volunteer fire department, essentially no police. So there's just a lot of things that wouldn't show much impact. So we have not elected so far to do a capital budget. And so that is why we're not able to have a specific growth limit on residential development. On the other hand, over the last 25 years, we've only had the sort of informal or possibly illegal limit of 25 exceeded once over 25 years, and that's the number of applications for new houses. Many of those houses have not been built out. People have gotten the applications but haven't done the building yet. So that doesn't reflect the actual growth in town. And to talk about where we are in town, I know there's a lot of concern about residential growth in Starksboro. I was thinking back to about 30 years ago or so, which is about as far back as I can remember. And we have, since that time, we've lost the one bar in town that we had, which apparently nobody noticed it. It was on the Heinsberg Hollow Road right next to Lazy Brook Trailer Park. There was a bar there. And 2 stores have gone since then. So we have, other than agricultural or forest product related businesses or home businesses, we actually have fewer businesses than we had back then. So we're not really a prime market for commercial growth. The fact that 2 small stores have not been able to survive here is kind of an indication of that. Other things, the schools still well below capacity. Our population, according to the U.S. Census, came down about 10% between 2000 and 2010. I know a lot of people wonder about that. I think the only explanation that I've heard that makes some sense is that many people moved in the 70s. Starksville population almost doubled between 70 and 80. A lot of those folks have kids, and a lot of those kids have moved away. And that's the only thing I can attribute to the fact that our population has gone down that significantly. So that's pretty much where we are. I think if there is a perception that we're going to have, that has existed as long as I've lived here, that we're going to get a lot of pressure for residences from both the north and the south. And we have gained some, we've obviously had growth, but it doesn't, and that is probably the area where it's most important that we have the regulations that can help define and guide that growth going forward. One of the things to keep in mind about commercial development in agricultural is we're sort of assuming that means the farmer is selling land, but also it applies if a farmer wanted to diversify, milk prices are way down, and they decided that it might be viable to have a tractor sales and service, then that would be something. So what we're looking at in the proposed regulations is giving agricultural landowners a little more flexibility on what they can do on their land so they can keep it intact as a farm, and that is getting harder and harder to do. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with the new regulations. So going forward, you ready to do that?
So if you can start now.
Okay. Going forward, just remind everybody that we have a vote next Tuesday, the 27th, right here in 7 to 7. But you can also vote by absentee ballot and request that either way from Cheryl, by phone, or to stop down at the office. So that's another option. So assuming that, that the vote passes and that the regulations that the Planning Commission and the Select Board voted on, if that passes, then we will go immediately to dealing with definitions in the areas that are need improvement in the plan. And we do that as the interim basis. We can vote on them. And it's my understanding from, because this is how we originally had our subdivision regulations, they were passed on an interim basis by the Select Board 25 years ago. If it's passed on an interim basis, it has to go before the whole town sometime within the next 2 years. So those changes in definitions, assuming that the zoning plan gets readopted, that will all come before those definitions come before the voters sometime in the next 2 years, probably town meeting. And that is pretty much it. I'll let Susan sum up.
Okay, I'm going to cover the part that Peter didn't. If these zoning regulations do not pass at the vote on September 27th, there is just not physically time to make any modifications to the zoning regulations and present something else before the town plan expires, because I think that's October 16th. So there wouldn't be physically time to go through the adjustment process, the warning process, the getting something else out there, in whatever form that might be. So the next thing that would happen would be that the Planning Commission would, I believe, do what they're going to do anyway, which is look at the town plan. And then they would probably, I don't know, they're a separately elected commission, so I don't know if their plan would be to jointly look at the zoning regulations and the town plan, or if they would want to get the town plan completely revised and in place first, and then look at the zoning regulations. I have a little bit of a concern as someone who really wants the zoning regulations to comply with the town plan. I have a little bit of concern about ending up in this endless loop of, town plan, zoning regulations, town plan, zoning regulations, and they're going to shoot me. I just don't see a town plan getting in place in 12 to 18 months. And then writing zoning regulations is a very detailed and time-consuming process. So I have a little bit of concern about the ability to make any changes at this point. But that's only my opinion. Everybody knows I already voted to adopt the regulations. And the purpose of the vote on the 27th is to hear what the voters think. So everybody please vote. Vote based on your research and what you believe. Tell your neighbors to please vote. I'm looking around the room. There are 30 people here who are not on one of the boards and commissions that are directly affected, and actually there's some people out there who are on one of the boards and commissions directly affected. I don't think there's ever been more than 60 people at an informational hearing. There are 1,300 registered voters in Starksville. So please encourage people to look at this issue. They can call anyone for information. You can call anyone in town. You can talk to anybody you want to talk to. You can talk to any of us. But just get information and look at the situation and make your decision, and please come to the polls. Okay.
Something I forgot to mention when I was going over the density and dimension chart It's quite a long list, a whole bunch of uses, potential uses that frankly I don't think we'll ever see here in Starksboro. So the question becomes, why did we include them? Well, as I said, we're not allowed to prohibit a use. And I know in South Burlington, they got caught because they had no provisions about a crematorium until suddenly one was proposed. And so as we were going through this, we tried to think of just about everything and put it there. So at least we have something for the board to work with, just in case somehow or other that came in. I just wanted to clarify that because I thought it was an important little piece of it, just looking at it. We went through it pretty well. Civic or highway maintenance facility, industrial uses. There it is. We've got a crematorium. At least we're allowed to get the high density as a conditional use. And just about anything you can think of would fall into one of these categories somewhere. So it is we have something in the regulation about it.
And yay, we're done talking at you. So we have plenty of time left to hear any questions. We have a whole lot of people here who would love to answer them. And I'm sure they're all more knowledgeable than I, so we'll find somebody who can answer.
I'm Jeff Donovan, Charlotte Road. I'm a former, I guess, not PRD, but predecessor member of the former board, planning commission member. And so I know what you're going through. It's a lot of work. And I have had a chance to kind of look through the documents. And I am a little concerned there may be some, shall we say, unintended consequences here. I've looked at the town plan, which to me looks excellent, and probably maybe needs very little revision, thankfully. But I'm not sure that the new document goes closer to the town plan than the old one in many respects. I know there's issues with the density cap, maybe, but there's a lot about that in the town plan. I don't think the little thing about phasing big developments will make much difference on the growth rate. And so it would be nice if there was something done other than that, rather than making it easier to develop, reducing the density levels so that the high density is more dense, adding the medium density, and really cutting the agricultural density. It used to be 25 acres with a provision to go to 1 if you set aside 9. Now there is, residential is still kind of that. It's 1 and 9 is sort of taken up by losing that development right. But now commercial is 2. There's no set aside. There's no so you literally could develop the entire street front of any, and maybe more, maybe deeper, of anywhere in the ag zone with 2-acre commercial lots. And now with the hugely expanded commercial areas and very little restriction on commercial size, we got gas stations, motels, laundromats, you name it, we pretty much are in the conditional use category. And there are some conditions that you can apply, but for the most part, I didn't see any that would prevent almost any of those uses from pretty much going through anywhere in town. So I think that potentially our agricultural corridor, which is strongly supported, and sprawl, which is strongly discouraged in the town plan, could actually be the result of this revision. Losing the agricultural corridor and having sprawl, literally it could happen, as I read this, from the border of Bristol to the border of Heinsberg and out States Prison Hollow Road to the border pump. That's Class 2 state roads. Also up in South Starksburg on Route 17 in the same area. And I just don't think that was the intent of the plan, and I'm not sure it was the intent of the Planning Commission. I think it may have been accidental. I mean, if you absolutely need to include some of these uses somewhere in town, many of them probably should not be in the scenic agricultural corridor if you read the town plan. They should be in the high density or maybe in the new low density or medium density district. Even some may be in some part of the high density, the medium, or maybe even some part of the low density district, but not necessarily in the ag district. You could be talking about a very similar development, maybe not quite as dense as what's happening all over Heinsberg now. I know it may not happen for a few years, maybe slow coming, but I think potentially, little by little, we could lose that whole, very important piece that was so strongly supported by the public forums years ago. But you could read the town-wide surveys that were done. They're in the town plan. It was like the one thing that everybody in town could agree on was the scenic agricultural corridor, and I think it could be gone.
Would anybody like to?
I wish I saw it your way, Jack, because I've read these over and over and over. I think you have to look at the density factor, and it is 10-acre density factor in the ag scene.
Not for commercial. That's only for residential.
I think you're not
Go to
correct. It's 211.
Yep. The density factor says residential density dwelling units per acre, 1 per 10. Then it gives lot size residential, lot size non-residential. So there's no density factor for non-residential, it's only for residential dwelling units per acre.
Well,
And it says residential density. It does not say any other components.
so you're reading, all right.
I think I'm reading it correctly, don't you?
That wasn't,
May not have been the
maybe
intent.
we need to remove the word
I mean,
resident.
I'm just telling you,
Yeah,
this is
no.
like the most
Okay.
egregious situation I saw, but I saw similar issues in some of the other districts. I think, I'm sorry, I know everybody, there's some great stuff in there. I want, all the stuff about enforcement, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. I wouldn't throw it out the window, but I think that there's a lot of areas here where I think there's been unintended consequences which could severely affect the density. I think there's some similar, not as bad issues in the low density where, for example, somebody could, come in, buy a large lot, which is partly in the forest district, transfer development credits. Yeah, it's preserving the forest district, but it's hard to develop there anyway, and end up with a large number of 1-acre lots on some of the backcountry roads, way more than we have now, pay off their lot and build their house on the remaining piece. I mean, I see that happen.
I understand that you've seen that happen. I just don't think that it would be interpreted to construe that the commercial density would be open-ended. I understand how you're reading it, but I think anybody would, but ours doesn't say that currently either. Our existing bylaws don't differ. I'm not saying that this doesn't need a little tweak. And I think anybody that looked at that would say it's a 10-acre maximum. And
It says residential density. What can be clearer than that?
Thank you, and I just want to make sure other people have a chance to talk. And I absolutely, I heard what you said. I absolutely heard you, and it does make sense. Okay.
There's copies of the density and use charts that have been referred to, as well as some of the draft language. Anybody can get a copy of them?
My name's Ellen. Just a couple clarifying questions. I wanted to, you had said something, Strickers, about that towns are no longer able to indicate in their zoning regs, things that are not allowed? Did you say that?
Yes.
So we can't say, the town of Starkville shall never have a gas station as an example, since that's a popular one to talk about. So if that is truly the case, then I'm curious about why it was that under, in this document here, that there's a conditional use, but not a site plan review, for instance. What was the reasoning for not including a site plan review on something like that?
I thought conditional use does.
It does? I'm just not familiar with what, so you have to do a site plan review if you have conditional use.
Yeah,
So then-
conditional use is just the next, it's the next step up.
So then, for instance, on a retail store, there's an S/C. So what's the differences there?
Conditional use is more specific to that property. The site plan review is more specific to things like traffic within that. So a retail store where you're going to have a lot more traffic coming and going, you'll want to concern yourself with that type of thing, and that's where you have the site plan review, or you're designing your site in a way that the traffic is going to flow and not cause problems on your site or out into the roads. That's where the site plan review comes in.
And to specifically, I apologize, that site plan review /C is, if it's less than, if the structure is less than 2,500 square feet, i.e. a small general store or something like that, it would only require site plan review. Wouldn't require both site plan and conditional. As you get larger, there's more impacts, and the density of use changes.
So another clarifying question then is, so if we can't indicate the types of commercial, particular businesses that we don't want in town because of the way in which, sort of the character and nature of our town, is it then in the planning, the town plan, that the sense of what we want and don't want shows up, and so the intention then is to have the zoning regs mirror that? Like which comes first, the chicken or the egg, in this kind of situation?
Well, I can. Well, yes, the plan comes first, and it's the intention of the regulations to implement the plan. It is the intention of every document in the town to comply with the law. So to the extent that a town plan is a very general guideline, and there are very specific laws, you might see that everybody in the town would hate to see a gas station, but if it's not legal to prohibit it, well, there we are.
Right, and that's where I'm trying to find a middle ground here, is if there's a way in which there's a sense of language that could be put forward to sort of signal to developers that these are the kinds of things that we're happy to support from a development standpoint in town, and these are the types of things that you're going to have a really hard time getting through because of whatever. And I get that that's really hard to just create that list, but I'm just wondering if there's any kind of way to provide those kinds of signals in any of our town documents for them.
Even if the gas station is still filled out there,
Again, that's indirect because everyone, the gas station, you know,
you can put one here, but there's no room to put one.
but there's no room to put one, so essentially you're prohibiting it. And from what I understand, that can be challenged. Well, there is, yes. Where? In the high density, in the existing high density?
Sure. There's a lot of unoccupied land there. Some of it's currently ag land, but it's right there along the road in the high density district.
Okay. Is it an appropriate place?
It might be.
Might be.
As opposed to
I much prefer that than doing, potentially, little by little strip hauling, and the whole road from one town to the next.
Again, and one of the documents that we used, they were not a document, but a study that we read, encouraged town plans to allow farmers to be a little bit more creative.
I think I saw some great stuff about that, value-added industry, agritourism.
And again,
That's perfect, that's all should be there. It's not the strip, it's the strip mall.
but again, it gets to be very difficult to allow some commercial and not others. You're picking and choosing, you're starting to discriminate. And that's where the court challenges come in. This is only advice of our planner.
I think if it's supporting the agricultural industry, I think you can come into it, in the appropriate way. I think you come up with the proper language and you will stand up in court.
I guess the question I have is, we can't support a small store on Route 116. Why do we think we might be having a strip mall showing up?
Well,
The economics just don't
maybe
make sense.
Maple Fields and McDonald's look at it differently. They might just decide that, halfway between Bristol and Heinz would be a good place to get home, and once you get going.
Well, we do have one right at the north end, just in Heinsberg, right on the north end of
They
the.
don't go very far to get gas.
I think that's just barely surviving. So,
I'm not saying it's gonna happen, I'm just saying, why encourage it?
I don't think it's being encouraged. I think what you're saying is why not prohibit it?
Well, at least in that, in the scenic corridor, it's a whole list of things that I don't think should be there. Which is, motels, hotels, laundromats, and convenience stores, and retail, and Walmart, and, you name it. Almost any of that, tell me if I'm wrong, but it looks to me like almost any of that is conditional use. And the conditions don't look too horrible. You gotta get the right lot size to get the 20% coverage, but, even that doesn't seem too tough to me.
What in the existing zoning?
Let me ask a question to the other people up here. What prohibits it now?
It's not a.
Right now, the current bylaws only restrict based on the building size for the most part. It has nothing to do with intensity of use or the impacts on the neighborhood, or very little. They define it as agricultural, commercial. They give you a couple of general ideas of what that might be. But if it's considered light industrial, it can be up to 20,000 square feet. But as a commercial use, it's limited to 1,500 square feet per floor, 2 floors. So it has nothing to do with impacts on the neighborhood or intensity.
Well, it talks about 10 cars per hour, including a gas station, for example, and probably a retail store. So there's more to it than that.
So I'm going to turn my head the other way and look at this side of the room and see if anybody has anything that they want to.
Can I just mention one thing, Jeff? Did you look at the special district standards for the ag, scenic, and rural residential district? The special district standards for the.
I may have seen those. Tell me the page.
What page?
It's page 2-12. It says, to the greatest extent feasible, given site-specific conditions, residential lots, building envelopes, and non-agricultural buildings in this district shall be located and configured in a manner that maximizes the use of the remaining area for agriculture. Placed within woodlands or along the edges of open agricultural fields or meadows adjacent to woodlands or hedgerows to reduce encroachment upon productive farmland, provide shade in the summer and shelter in the winter, and to enable new residential development to better blend the surrounding natural landscape. Now, I take that to mean commercial as well, because it says non-agricultural building.
I would agree with you, Danny, but I don't think that really, it says the greatest extent possible or feasible, but if you subdivided a 2-acre lot and it's put on the highway, where are you going to go on that lot?
But it can't be placed on the best ag land.
Well, it doesn't really prevent you from doing that. It does encourage that, which is nice, but
and that's left up to the DRB because it is a conditional use.
Yeah, and it does say hedgerow, which would tend to be right along the road. So, maybe that helps a little bit, but I don't think it really stops it.
It also has to go through.
Why put commercial uses in that you don't want there if you don't have to? And I don't think you have to. It's simple as that.
But that
South Burlington, a lot of that farmland soil is not South.
But it has to go through this process and that process. So they're both of them together, and then also anything that is a conditional use, the DRB can look at the project specifics and put conditions on that. And as I said before, we do not have to let every project meet the limits that are defined in the guidelines as the maximum limits for any project. As long as we have defensible reasons and can document those for why that
So
specific
it has to be a
project.
condition based on something that's in the regulation, and there's just not much there that will cover this project. I really don't think there is. I mean, I don't really want to conclude with that. Maybe you want them in high density district, maybe even a medium density district. I just strongly feel that it's a mistake to encourage it in the ag district.
And we have half an hour left, so. Yes, I know. There's no clarification.
So the view, you head south, you're making south of the village more of a high-density area, including the trailer park area and the freedom acres. So that means that now that's no longer part of the agricultural corridor?
Correct, it's in a different zoning district.
I had a question, and in keeping in the spirit of the town plan, you know, the zoning regulations found in the town plan, that may sound like a broken record to someone else up front, but it says the town's land use regulations should be revised to strongly discourage single-story commercial buildings and franchise architecture in this area. I don't see anywhere in the new zoning regulations that discourage single-story commercial buildings.
That would be our architectural standards, which require roofs with gable ends and pitches.
That doesn't make it 2 stories. Well, a cupola doesn't make a building 2 stories. You're talking the difference between Firehouse Plaza and the building at the new Bristol Bakeries in Times Square. Firehouse Plaza is single story, Bristol Bakeries 2 story.
I thought we covered that pretty well in our architectural standards because
A cupola doesn't make it 2 stories.
it gives it a character,
Doesn't make it 2 stories though. 2 stories would have an upstairs.
A cow shed is not 2 stories either. It's made to look like a it's made to look like a cow shed. I'd say it's doing pretty well.
It says discourage, it doesn't say prohibit.
Right. So strongly discouraged. Those are strong words, and there's nothing in there, zero in the town plan. There's only regulations.
I have 2 places that I wanted to ask about. One is the heart of what Scott was just talking about there, might have been talking about. And this doesn't have to do with the numbers and all this kind of stuff. I don't know the regulations. But the new town plan, as far as I understand, would allow a storage unit to go in front of the trailer park.
Brookside.
Now, I think that's just not good vision for the town. I don't know how you changed it or how you made something like that not possible. I don't see a problem with a house or 2 there. I think that it'd be a great place to put a basketball hoop and hoops and but when it comes to envisioning something good for the town, I think that ways should be found to make that work and other things not just happen just because the zoning says, oh, we're going to do it. So I don't see I'd like to see better vision around that. The trailer park is, I don't think anybody would want a storage unit put in front of your house. I don't think that would, I just don't think that would be desirable for anybody here. And then another thing I just want to ask you about this map, and Susan Jeffries is right that people are you know, if you live next to a field, that something could happen, then you're a little bit more aware of it. And I've talked to a number of people, everybody on the select board, and a few people, and Dave and Danny about this, but this area here is now medium density, or it would be medium density. And in that field next to me, it would now be allowed to build a certain number of houses. Well, the acreage went from 25 acres in this area to, as far as I know, to about 2.5. Now, I don't know, could it have gone to 12 maybe? Maybe that would limit the houses, but sure, I'm not against housing or anybody building a new house that I could see, but I'm against the idea of planned unit development. We could allow, you know, maybe 10, 12 houses there in a very short space of time, maybe a couple of years. And the ownership of the land belongs to the Heinsberg Sand and Gravel, and I think that if they also own part of the forest conservation area, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but part of that area, the development rights could come down onto the land, and that helps increase the number of houses that you can have in the field. So I just think that doesn't have the spirit of the town plan, the present town plan. I'm talking about the spirit of the plan. I don't think this had to become medium density, or if it did, the acreage could have been a lot more. That's just working with the spirit of the plan and the vision that the town has for certain areas.
Well, and I would say that the plan and the survey results also said that development should be encouraged along the main corridors. So to the extent that development occurs, it should be encouraged to be near areas that are already developed and along the paved roads.
Some development.
Right, so that was the thinking in terms of creating that kind of transition space, because right now I think we go right from high density to forest conservation or ag. It's a big transition.
Well, I think with the PUD there, the density could actually be greater in that field than it is in town. It might be allowed in a higher density. The reality is that if you had 10 houses in that field, that's in that space, you would have more density than you would in most of the town.
And in order to do that, there would also have to be land that would be set aside and stay open.
Right, you don't see the set aside thing to see maybe 10 houses.
Well, as I...
It's just a difference of opinion. I'm not
saying
the board.
As I understand it, no, I'm saying as I understand it, though, that would be a conditional use that would go before the DRB. And the DRB, one of the things that is in here is that the DRB would encourage, is it too strong to say require? The DRB could require that development be as minimally intrusive, you know, along tree lines, along the edge of the property, not a bunch of big houses right out in the middle of the field. And I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I'm saying that there are some protections there.
Or they could require it all to be in the high density portion of that Heinsberg Sand and Gravel also.
I mean, medium density.
No, high density. Steinberg, if we're going to talk Heinsberg Sand and Gravel, we need to understand that they don't, some in high density, they don't, some in what would be proposed as medium density and forest and conservation. And so technically, all those development rights could wind up through the process with the DRB high density.
But do they require that?
It's a PUD. Can they require it? No, but they can strongly encourage it. No, Jeff, PUDs are always done that way. The board has a great deal of input into how these projects come together.
But the acreage, if we're going from 25 to 2.5, does that reflect the town plan that we have now, or is that reflect?
The town plan reflected a medium density district, envisioned a medium density district up through there. They said we needed to transition, was it 2.5 I can't tell you that. I also know that the Planning Commission last summer held 3 separate informational meetings at 3 separate times. At least one individual who has advocated strongly for lower density and that transition area attended those meetings and, you know, certainly supported what the Planning Commission had proposed based on the town plan. So those meetings were allowed, or were held. Everybody was encouraged to come.
Can you tell me where in the town plan? I don't remember seeing it.
What's that, town plan? I'd have, I'll have.
I have a question, because I've been hearing a lot of concerns, and what's really confusing to me right now is that I'm hearing really specific concerns, but I'm also hearing from people up on the table that basically are the old standards, our old bylaws, or whatever, sorry, zoning bylaws, would allow a lot of what the concerns are now, and the new ones are putting more restrictions. So I guess what I need to hear from you all is that true? I mean, a lot of these worries that I'm hearing, are they allowable under the old bylaws?
Yes, practically everything, except, as I said earlier, there are a few things that are prohibited outright by the old regulations, although we've also heard that we probably can't. Like the commercial dog kennels, for instance, are prohibited anywhere in town by the old regulations, but I think that that wouldn't be upheld in court. But there's nothing else that is outright prohibited, except junkyards and toxic waste, basically. Everything else we have to consider. And the categories and the definitions are so broad in the existing bylaws that we have trouble justifying that something is not allowed. I have concerns also about the self-storage project that was proposed, and we approved that, and it was not unanimous, but I was one of the people who voted for it. And the reason I voted for it is because I could not find anything in the current old regulations that would let me say, no, this can't go there. It was overthrown by the environmental court. They said that we interpreted one particular word differently than they did. And that's part of the problem. That was a case where a neighbor brought a Wikipedia definition, the applicant brought a pile of other definitions. People gave us zoning from other towns, and that's really the best we had to go on. We had quite a lot of discussion. It went on for more than one meeting, possibly 3, I don't really remember. But I actually think that that project has a better chance of, well, I mean, the court already threw it out, but if it were just the DRB, it has a better chance of being turned down in the new regulations. Because at least a majority of us, I think actually 6 of us, couldn't find any reason in the old regulations where we could write a defendable reason for not letting it happen. Because there just is nothing in the old regulations that can really stop us from doing, you know, we can't keep things from happening, and we also can't enforce the conditions. It's very frustrating that we put these conditions on things and then there's no process to have them actually enforced. And then we have to not only approve, I mean, so now there's a project out there with all these conditions that we know are not being upheld or abided. The person, you know, who's applied for that permit admits that themselves, and we can't prohibit the next one. We're not allowed to. Our lawyer told us we can't say, no, we won't approve this because you're not paying attention to the conditions on the last one. So actually evaluate individual uses and come up with reasons not to let them happen.
So just to clarify, because that gives a lot of information. So for example, with Jeff's, in the old regulations, could there be a strip mall?
Yes.
Okay, so we still have some of these problems, right?
There's a size limitation. So if somebody were to build a strip mall, they would basically have to build it in pieces that fit that coverage and footprint limitation. But there's nothing in there that can stop them from applying for and being approved for a strip mall.
I think we need a little training. I mean, it really looks like you guys again are tied. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I will say though that this is a way better thing than 40 years ago when there was no zoning whatsoever in town. And so we do evolve, and we evolve slowly, it's painful, but we do evolve. So we have the existing regulations that you're operating under now, and now you're proposing to try and go to the next level. And you should be commended for the work that you guys have done. Because obviously it's a really pain in the ass. I mean, it really is. I'm stunned listening to this stuff. So you need to move forward. And if we have, to Jeff, your comments, if we have little problems or issues, I think those can be addressed down the road. But we certainly shouldn't try to put it down at that point. You guys have done a hell of a job.
Dan has had his hand up on the so I want to make sure.
Okay, yes. Betsy Donovan, you played right into a question that I have, is that if these zoning rules get adopted, and they get voted for, and there are, and we discover either because we think our way through it or because we have someone who comes with a proposal for a development that exposes some of these weaknesses and unintended consequences that we've been talking about. What does the town do to protect itself from development going haywire? How do we proceed?
I tell you just about something I read about recently, and it may or may not pertain to Statesboro, but I read that Vermont has the highest per capita number of Dollar General stores. I'll use the mic so that my deaf husband in the background like this. He's nice. He lets me give him a hard time at meetings. So Vermont has the highest per capita number of Dollar General stores in the United States. So we don't have as many of them as, say, Colorado, but for the population, we have far more. And what Dollar General Stores has done is that they have looked at towns in Vermont, and they've targeted towns with what they consider to have weak zoning regulations, and they come in with a team of lawyers and say, we're going to put a store right here. And they've used the weak zoning regulations in the town to push it through. That does not mean that a Dollar General store couldn't come into Starksboro. It does mean that it would have to go to the Development Review Board, and they would have some tools at their disposal to impose conditions that would strongly discourage them. And the other thing that I read in this decision, in this article, is that if somebody comes to you and proposes a project, you cannot retroactively change your zoning. So that project can go through and then you can shut it down. But you can't go back and say, oh, we have this project on the table, we don't like it, we're going to retroactively change our zoning. And I think that it's good to hear about some of the areas that people are concerned about, because I know when the Planning Commission wrote these, they knew what they meant, they knew what they expected, they knew what the intention was, and they did a heck of a job putting all of those intentions into the regulations. But it's really easy to come in after the fact and try to read things a different way and try to put a different interpretation on things than was ever anybody's intent, as we found with the elderly housing bonus. So that's nothing that anybody on this board wants to see. To the extent that it can legally be done, then that's what we'd be looking at for interim zoning. And sooner rather than later, select board has had any conversations about, oh, let's just lay back and see what happens. We've identified a handful of things that need attention immediately and are very interested in making sure, again, to the extent that it is legal. We can't say no gas stations ever or no storage units ever anywhere. But to the extent that we can, that it would be legal and enforceable, we would like to make sure that these regulations are nice and tight and can be applied consistently and fairly and be supported.
But what is one of my notes was we need an ongoing sort of legal mechanism within the town to continue to improve and close loopholes and eliminate unintended consequences. What is that process? Is that what
That
you're
is
talking
interim
about?
zoning. Yes, interim zoning, it can be adopted by the select board and it is good for 2 years. And interim zoning is a really quick process. Now, we've been, the Planning Commission approved this draft of the zoning regulations on March 17th. So that's how long it's taken us to get from there 4 years of writing the regulations to the point where we are today. So the actual zoning law permanent changes are a long drawn-out process, as they should be, because they have pretty big effect. Interim zoning is, one of those, oh my goodness, that was an oversight, that was never intended kind of things that the select board can actually enact fairly quickly. And it's good for 2 years. And sometime during that 2 years, the select board has to go through the formal process. I don't think it requires a public vote, but it requires all the review by the Planning Commission, it requires the public hearings, it requires a select board public hearing, it requires a formal adoption after public hearings. And then a vote if we choose to do that or if we receive a petition. So that's the thing that says, okay, there's a lot of good that's in here, and if there are a couple of things that need to be addressed, that can be done fairly quickly.
And what is the mechanism for bringing conditions like tonight? There have been a number of potential issues like that identified, and this meeting is a mechanism for bringing that to the attention of the select board and the planning commission. Going forward, what is the mechanism? Just somebody coming and tapping you on the shoulder saying, I just noticed something in here. What's the mechanism?
I believe that interim zoning has to be proposed by the Planning Commission. That's my understanding, is that interim zoning begins there, and the Planning Commission has to agree, and then it comes to the select board. So the place to start, if there were any other concerns, would be the Planning Commission, because they are the people who have to propose the
a Planning Commission meeting and present your concern.
Yeah, and I'll tell you an interim zoning story. I was a brand new select board member. I've been on the select board maybe 6 months. The Planning Commission looked at things that were happening in town, and some members of the Planning Commission said, oh, the town is going in a bad direction. We need to do something because our current zoning regulations don't allow us to stop it. And it wasn't unanimous, but members of the Planning Commission passed interim zoning regulations and brought them to the select board. And I didn't know what the heck was going on. I had been on the board 6 months and thought, this is way over my head. I have no idea what's happening. But the select board considered those interim regulations and thought, we don't have the same fear. We don't see these same threats. And I've been on the select board almost 11 years now, and that was 10 years ago, and none of those things have happened. So that's not saying they won't, but that it's easy to say, oh my goodness, this could happen and be everywhere in a year. If that's a real concern, then we would certainly like to go through the process of making sure that it's covered in interim zoning, because we really don't want, I don't want loose standards or loose land use development regulations. I want something that people can look at and say, let's not even try it in Starksboro, or, you know, this is a use that would be permitted, let's go for that. I'd also like for people to be able to look at these, if they're considering land in Starksboro for development, to look at these and say, well, here's what might fly or might not fly, and then they can make their purchasing decision or their initial approach to date based on something that's solid. Right now, I think people come and sit down with Dave and have a chat about what might or might not work. And he tries to read the minds of the DRB and give them some guidance. And he's probably pretty good at it, but there's still a lot of guessing based on past decisions.
That's probably not a bad method, where you got an expert there.
Quick question. A couple of quick questions. One is, when you're talking about adopting interim zoning, are you talking about adopting interim zoning within the next month before the town plan expires?
Yes.
Or are you saying, so that within the next month, the planning commission would have to make a decision that it sees these problems in the zoning, they just wrote, and then you would adopt interim zoning. And if it doesn't happen by October 18th, we don't change the zoning until we have a new town plan.
That is correct. And that's why we've already identified 5 areas, and we have draft interim zoning regulations that we are prepared to take a look at in our next meetings and work with.
Then over time, a couple other quick questions. One specific one on transfer development rights. So you were saying, you know, right now, if you've got, let's say, a small lot of low density, you've got a large piece in forest and conservation, that would be very, very hard to develop, right? You might have a ravine, steep slopes, no access. Under this new zoning, you could transfer, let's just say it was 100 acres, you could transfer 4 development rights to your low density district. And then at that point, then would you get if you applied for a PUD, could you then apply for a density bonus on top of those transferred rights?
I believe so, but I'll ask the experts.
I believe that's the way it would be. If they're done for affordable, as they're proposing for interim zoning, the intent would be the 100, granting the extra would have to be dedicated in perpetuity to elderly affordable housing.
Good. So my reading, go back to Marjorie, your question, my reading of towns around us, I found, looked to me like our standards and our bonuses were really significantly higher than other towns, or other towns actually didn't have those numbers. And so I'm wondering, did you find anything where did you find 100% density bonuses for PUDs or lighting standards that were comparable to the lighting standards that are here? And I asked the question because when Peter went through the list of things that you were considering, there's a long list of things or tweaks that have come up. And kind of my question, and I with full respect for all the work that everybody did, and I'm sure that you won't see this, but we're about to go through a town plan process. And a lot of these standards, you've stated, need to be tweaked or changed or understood or explained why they're going to work. Why not go through that town planning process, explain them, talk about them, work collaboratively, not throw a baby out with the bathwater, bring the town together, refine them, adopt the town plan, and then move forward with the zoning.
I think one of the main concerns is the old zoning is not enforceable to the extent that it really ought to be. And the new zoning has enforcement provisions that will allow us to enforce the fact that conditions have to be met. And that's one of the very significant differences between the two plans is enforcement. That's one that hasn't come up in the past. And the tweaks are not, we're talking about are primarily not in standards, but in definitions. And it's kind of a different, semantics again, is kind of a different thing. It's just things that aren't defined very well. It's not changing the standards, but just changing the explanation of them, I guess.
So it was just to clarify, you said the density bonuses, and then this is what I heard, the density bonuses, the lighting standards, the issues that Jeff
We
pointed
didn't,
out.
no, not lighting standards, we're talking about the lighting trespass and lumen definitions.
So minor changes is what you're proposing.
And density was for PUD, 100%, if all the units are dedicated perpetually for either affordable and or elderly. Yes.
Not talked about, I'm sorry.
Well, and Scott's had his hand up after for a while, so can we let Scott?
Oh, sorry. You're right, I didn't realize it was.
I wanted to piggyback on what Jim talked about with the storage unit building there. I happen to be the neighbor who took the, went to environmental court and bought that storage unit going in. But what it says in the town plan is efforts should be made to knit this, it's talking about Brookside Mobile Home Park. Knit this existing high-density neighborhood into the fabric of the village. Within and adjacent to the park, the town's regulations should allow and encourage infill development with modest affordable homes, starter homes, cottage-style homes, etc. Putting a storage unit in there would only isolate that mobile home park from the rest of the community. With its fence around it, and of course it's higher traffic. So again, there is in the regulations, the new ones, specifically a section on storage units which allows them. And they're allowed to be on, they have to be on at least 2 acres. That happens to be a 2-acre lot, which is pretty convenient, I guess. So, you know, I don't see how that is knitting, letting something like that go in there knits that mobile home community into the fabric of the village.
I agree with that as well.
But
Not
if
like the
these,
pleasure
if these
of the-
regulations are passed, there will be a storage facility going in there probably next summer. Almost definitely. Anybody disagree with that?
In all of our districts, they're all mixed-use districts.
I'm just, again, I'm reciting my
I
own
know,
plan.
I know. But that's one paragraph, each within the town plan, some language each within the town plan, and all of our districts are mixed-use districts. So to suddenly say that that can only be residential, only would be essentially spot zoning, which is not legal.
No, you can make a zoning district that was high-density residential. That's not spot zoning.
When all of our other districts are mixed use, it would be difficult.
The agricultural district is mixed use?
Yeah. Right.
the workshop results, the pictures, I still have the pictures somewhere of where people stuck the pins in the boards. There were 6 or 7 different committees that met one Saturday morning to express their ideas. A lot of people here were in those meetings. What they gave us does represent what was expressed in those surveys and those workshops and is on those boards with the pins.
My voice is giving out, so I clearly need to be quiet. I would also say that the town plan is more of an umbrella document. It's not a spot document. It's not a document that says this lot can only be this one thing. It's an umbrella, bigger picture of what people would like for the town to be. And that does not mean that every single landowner under every single case will be exactly wishing for what each of us thinks is this lot's purpose in the town plan. And it's a bigger document that is a more visionary document, and it does not impose specific restrictions lot by lot throughout the town. And personally, I don't think it should. I think it should encompass the larger vision for what we want to see of the town in the future. And we're running past our time, and we need to get out of the school. But okay, Jeff?
Unrelated, I just wanted to mention this one on page 1-5, community facilities. Community facilities are allowed in all zoning districts. They shall meet the same standards for compatible non-residential uses. That's all districts. That includes watershed protection, for example. The list of community facilities, of course, includes anything owned by the town or the state, schools, places of worship, hospitals, and waste management facilities.
That's right out of statute.
You have to have that in the watershed protection district?
You have to, yes. You can only regulate based on setbacks and dimensional requirements and that kind of thing. That's right out of statute.
Okay. So you've got the town water supply, and you have to have a wastewater.
Well, it may not ultimately go there, but we can't necessarily restrict it. There probably would be conditions and reasons not to think it should go there, but we can't restrict it.
Then the other comment I had was that there was a comment about the conflict between the zoning map and the zoning description. And on page, section 1.5 of the current zoning, or original zoning.
2006 regulation.
2006, there you go. It says the location and boundaries of the zoning districts are established as described in Article 5 and shown representationally on the zoning map. So there isn't a conflict because the legal description is in Article 5 and the zoning map is only a representation. That being said, I'm not against this, but I think you can get similarly into confusion when you're depending on a map, unless each of the boundaries is also somehow defined on the map. For example, I don't necessarily know where the boundary here is, on the map. There's a few other places. Where is this boundary? Where's this boundary?
That's described on that map as either a contour or a specific distance from the road.
There's nothing on Shaker Hill Road on the downhill side.
That's right. On the downhill side, with everything.
And then it tapers off and somehow connects to the 800 foot. I mean, I know that's the way it was, but it's not described.
We haven't changed that, so.
It is described, it was described in the old zoning.
Not very well, but okay.
I
I wanted to raise folks' awareness on the lighting. Everybody seems to think 50,000 is absolutely huge. I want to make you aware that outside of the street light out here that shines on the parking lot, which illuminates basically half the parking lot, is a 400-watt mercury vapor light. It's 22,000 lumens. I hope you folks that are maybe parked at the upper end can find a vehicle. I mean, and that's not downshielded, it's not directed light, or even partially shielded, so you can see that what 22,000 lumens look like. It's a lousy light because it's yellow, but it does show you. The street lights down here are approximately 1,800 to 2,000 lumens. Those are 20-watt LEDs.
What are the street lights? So this one.
The street lights are 1,800 to 2,000. They're 20-watt LEDs here in the village.
So there's someone who hasn't spoken before, so we're going to go over here.
Along that lines, I think it was Hugh who mentioned that lighting limits would be interpreted, at least, as that lighting limits would be prorated along with the lot coverage percentages. So if the lot is 50,000, or the limit is 50,000 in a commercial, for commercial use, but you can only develop 20% of that, then really the limit would be interpreted as being 10,000 per acre. Is that correct? And my question is, would other development review board members, or is that how it's intended? And anybody else on the planning commission or on the review board would interpret it the same way? Versus, like, when I read it, it says per acre. Not necessarily that way. It could also be interpreted as being on a 2-acre lot, 100,000 limits. That's pretty significant.
If you would do the mathematical calculation.
Yeah.
So that is, and that's commercial use.
Yep.
Residential use has a lower limit.
For sure.
And it's my understanding, although we don't have a project before the DOE that asks for anything specific. But if somebody had a huge piece of land that I don't even think exists that could be developed and wanted to put a larger, something that would cover most of an acre, my understanding is they'd get most of the 50,000. Or if they could go to the DRB and they could show that there was a need for, on a smaller project, if there was a need to have 50,000 lumens, and that it was properly downshielded and they did not affect, didn't shine off of the property line, met all of the lighting setbacks. And that's something else in the lighting standards is a setback. That you have to set your light fixtures back, for however high the light fixtures are, you have to set them back from the property line 3 times that height. And they aren't allowed to shine off the property. So I would presume, on a case-by-case basis, if someone went to the DRB and said, yes, my development is only this large, however, here's why I need to exceed that lighting, then the DRB could say, okay, but you can only exceed it during these times, maybe. They could impose some other restrictions. Or if they didn't have a good reason, then they could say, no.
I disagree. I think it's up to 50,000, what you think. And you can't exceed that. Right.
Now, what I'm saying is that we could go up to 50,000 on a 1-acre development that only 20% of it was used. You wouldn't necessarily back the $50,000, I wish, 50,000 lumens off to the 20% of 50,000 lumens.
No, you would.
If you would, or if they had a reason for it.
You would.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
understand.
They're the experts.
If you have 2 acres, you could double it, have 100,000, and put it wherever you want. Where does it
Well,
say?
you still have to stick it in the footprint area, and it has to be down.
It doesn't say that, that's the problem.
And that's an up to.
It's a good idea.
It's not a given if you're gonna get the 50,000. That's up to the discrepancy of the DRB.
Sounds good.
And a lot of interest has been expressed about character of the area and how that fits in. I would lead people to look at the definitions and character of the area. And I think you'd have to conclude that there are, is 50,000 appropriate a year in the school parking lot? Maybe. Is it appropriate down the road? I think you have to look at that character of the area the way that it's described here. I think the DRB would conclude that that's not possibly acceptable. Might be, but it's probably not acceptable based on the character of the surrounding area. So you have to look at it in the context of the whole bylaw.
Yes,
Real quick.
Wayne.
Yeah, I'm sorry, real quick. I live in Twin Acres, and so now we're in the high density area. Does the planning board take into account stipulations and deeds? Because the use of our road is very restricted. The
do something like purchase property with various conditions on it, that those get into the deed and that they're recorded as part of our decision, and that our decision is not final until that happens, because we specifically don't want to get into a situation where that kind of agreement has been made and it's not on record and not enforceable for the DRB, say 10 years from now, which has been an issue in other towns. And absolutely, if it's in the deed, we can't.
Right. And the other part of that, real quick, is that if, like in the old zoning laws, there was usually a hearing. If somebody wanted to build somewhere, there was a hearing of all the neighbors getting together. Is that going to still occur, or is that out the window?
There will be more hearings now because there are more conditional uses. Currently, there are no hearings for 89% of the permits issued.
Right.
If it's something that's just permitted, we don't, the neighbors don't hear it and we don't hear it. It just goes to the zoning administrator and is permitted. And there are far more conditional uses. I'm not 100% sure that, but I think that, for instance, in every time that there's a 50,000 lumen maximum limit, those are all conditional uses, or almost all of them. So they would come to us. It's not automatic.
So what about, somebody buys that piece of land on the casino from the guy who now owns the Santa Fe, and they want to put something there. They would have to build their own road. They would not be able to put on flowers at all.
That's one of your covenants, then that's correct, they would have to build
Because
their
we
own.
take care, we maintain the road ourselves. The town doesn't want it, so we take care of it, so,
In that case,
yeah.
I was not aware of that, but,
Yeah, there are certain things you gotta be, you gotta
yeah,
learn.
you know, but the same with any other private road, they wouldn't, another development wouldn't necessarily be able to automatically attach to it.
Good, that's good.
But if there's a right of way across somebody's land, you can still use it.
Oh, it's a right of way, that's different.
It'd have to be, you'd have to refer to the restrictions.
One more comment from down the table here.
So on the lighting out there in the parking lot, that actually exceeds our current our proposed regulations. So there's actually more lumens out there than would be permitted under the regulations.
And they're not downshifted either.
No,
They're
not
downshifted before. And right now, I can put whatever lights in front of my house I want to keep my neighbors up all night.
I don't know how many people are familiar with St. Jude's Catholic Church in Heinsberg, but 3 light poles were put up out there this summer, and those lights produce 22,692 lumens, and that is about 30% more than what our proposed regulations would allow. So anyone would like to just see what that looks like, they can drive in there up until 10 o'clock. That's when they go out.